Now we have all our components together. We've got our hard parts all laid out, our sub-assemblies all done. We've got our small parts laid out. We've got our new pump bolts all set up. We've got our bearings laid out, our coupler, our case small parts, brand new small parts ready to go. So now we're ready to assemble the transmission. To begin our assembly of the transmission, we're going to take a couple of high-tech wood blocks here. We're going to raise up the bell housing to create a gap here between the bench and the bell housing. And the reason why we're doing that is because the K2 or the input shaft is going to stick through the bell housing and will touch the bench if we don't create this gap here. So let's get started loading our components up. The first thing we're going to do is to load up our K1 drum. We're going to use our needle bearing right here. That's great. Now we're going to install the B3 brake. The thing we want to notice about the B3 brake, it only goes on one way. We see there's a gap, a large tooth here. The others are smaller. That corresponds with the gap for the tooth right here. This lines up the feed hole in the pump. So we're going to set that down on here. Nice and easy. Just gently tap it down in. Perfect. Next is the clutch hub and ring gear assembly. That's going to go into 2 sets of splines. Hear how it makes that nice noise, that thunk noise? We can tell it's all the way in. Cool. Okay, now we're going to the K2 drum bearing goes down into the hub, sits down there nice and smooth. We have the race that goes onto the center planet. Now that's you may have to put a little assembly gel in here to hold this on to the planet assembly. This fits pretty good now. Fits on there real nice and it's not going to fall off. It's almost clipped in there. So now we're going to take that whole assembly . Okay, now that's all one piece. We're going to take our center planet to K1 drum bearing and install it down inside of the drum. Fits real nice. And the last step is to work the rear planet assembly down into the drum. Now we lift it up. Hear that nice clunk? That means it's settled all the way down in there and it's engaged into all the clutches. Now we have the guts all lined up onto the case here. Everything's set and nice and smooth. Now we're ready to put the case down on. We have our components all loaded up onto the bell housing. Now we have to finish installing a couple of components into the case before we load it on top of all of that. So let's start with the park pawl going into the case. This is that's just gonna sit back there. It'll be supported by the output shaft. Now we're gonna go in with the B2 brake drum housing. We're going to be sure that these bolts align with the bolts in the case. We're going to slide that back down into the case. There, we hear it bottom out. It's exactly what we want to hear. We know it's seated well into the case. Now we're going to install the bolts. I'm going to use my gun here just to run these bolts down. Now you want to use your inch-pound torque wrench and secure these to 96 inch-pounds. Got the drum secured. Now we're going to lift the case up and install our BR clutches. Clutch steel, clutch steel. We've soaked our clutches for 10 minutes in ATF. Just like the rest of our frictions, this one has the dish down. You can feel it, so we're going to, the dish is this way. I'm going to drop that in on the case, followed by a steel plate alternating steel, friction, steel, until we get to the pressure plate. Okay, one more steel, one more clutch, finally the pressure plate down in there. And we're going to secure that, the rest of that, with the snap ring. We got to work our way down in there. Start one end into the groove and just work it with our hand so it's seated all the way down in the case. Okay, the last thing we need to do is to check clutch clearance of the BR clutch. As you can see, we've got our feeler gauge right in between the pressure plate and the selective snap ring. The specification is 1 to 1.4 millimeters. Okay, now we're ready to put the case on top of the transmission. Okay, we've got our clutches loaded up in the case, and we've got our guts loaded up on the bell housing, and let's put them both together. I'm just going to raise that up. Down on there. Okay, notice we've got to engage the clutches, right? So what we can do is we can use the output coupler and spline that to the shaft. There. This takes a little bit of coaxing. Now we can see it's nice and flush with the plate. See, now we're going to take a couple of new bell housing bolts, starting in my hand. Now it's really important to use new bell housing bolts because these are aluminum bolts and they like to stretch. So we're going to carefully run those bolts down. All right, now we got the bolts in, the case is together. We're going to roll the case over and install the rest of our bell housing bolts. Okay, we just finished running in 15 bell housing to case bolts. We've already torqued the inner bolts, the 30 Torx bits, to 96 inch-pounds. Now we're going to torque these outer bolts to 90 inch-pounds, and that's going to complete attaching the bell housing to the case.